Hi, in this video I want to discuss how life is a lesson, life is a lesson, like any lesson. Life is an unlearnable lesson. Life creates all sorts of lessons, right? Life is a creation of lessons. Life is a character builder. We're characters. Not only are we literally being built up by being born, and being growing and then aging, we're character building because we're experiencing experiences. And our very function and form is an experience, but also the byproduct of all these other experiences. And our physical form creates a byproduct for all these other experiences that we call character building and the ability to feel pain and suffering. So that's a good way of looking at it, I suppose. When it comes to character building, metaphorically and physically speaking, we're a character in the process of building and decomposing and decharactering in many ways. Once you've gone over that hump, the life hump, humping obviously very relevant in many other ways as well. So life is an unlearnable lesson. Um, Constantly learning lessons, obviously constantly character building. This goes back to character building. Obviously that's the only function we have. Life is an unlearnable lesson though, because unless the things that are given life, obviously the lesson has to be not learned until the lesson can be learned. On its own, life cannot be learned unless by its byproduct. In and of itself, it can't be learned because it's based on non-consent. But if the things that are being victims of this non-consent, life is a function, you can view it as something else, is something that just is the reproduction. You're a function, you're a representation of life. And life is a lesson, figuratively speaking, that can't be learned because it's consent against um, a being born. So it's a lesson that can never be learned because it's reproduction. Life is based on reproduction, consumption. It's something that can't be learned because it's part of the function of existence. But it's something that you can, as a byproduct, being a byproduct of existence, as life, being a byproduct of living the sentient experience and not life as an idea, is something that you can control and you can change that. But it was still a lesson that can't be learned. It's only a lesson that can be destroyed. It's only something that can be eliminated. The lesson cannot be learned. The lesson can only be destroyed, burned up into fire. Because the lesson cannot be changed. The lesson can only be eliminated. If that's any way of looking at it. It can only be destroyed more than it can be changed. But obviously it's a change, it's destroyed, but it can't be changed reasonably. You can't change the function of existence. You can only function the same way in existence. You can never get the consent of a person before they're born because they're not born yet. They don't exist. Um, Obviously, and that's the function of existence, and the reason why it's compared to a unlearnable lesson because it has to do with consent. It's a lesson that we have. Obviously, many people are hypocrites. Obviously, they're against rape, but not against consent for a child being born. Um, but obviously, it's an unlearnable lesson because of the consent. You have no consent against someone, and life is based on that consent. That's what it's based on, is consent, willingness, a will. You can't hurt something that has no will, has no existence. You can only hurt something that has existence. But you're obviously perpetrating that existence by the very function of having a child or reproducing. And it's against their will, it's against their consent. And there's no way you can get consent just because it already happened. Just because your grandparents had your parents and the parents had you doesn't mean you have to be fall through the same hole as them and be a victim of the same old circumstance creating you that's going to create someone else. And now you're a victim of the circumstance of creating someone else. Not only are you a victim of your parents and your grandparents, you're a byproduct of all these experiences and interactions. You're going to be part of that experience, and you're going to realize now I have to be responsible for someone else once if you make the same mistake. So now you're responsible, and now you're a life perpetrator. Now you're someone that can be just as blamed just as much as anyone else. You blame them for having you, and then you have someone as well. Well, obviously, maybe you had fewer kids, but you still had a kid, and you perpetrated someone's consent. And obviously, it's about preventing. And obviously, if having one kid preventing you from having from 10 kids later on, obviously we won't necessarily figure that out, but you can say you're threatening someone with having 10 kids now as opposed one kid now as opposed to 10 kids then. Okay, they let you have one kid now, and it's okay, no more 10 kids now. And that's in a way, I guess, a threat you can use as a way of knowing more than anything, but you're still violating consent. You didn't do it as badly, but you're still violating consent. But that doesn't rationalize it. You still did it, and now you have no reason. Oh, you still have reason, but you're more of a hypocrite at that point in time than anything else. So obviously, lesson that you perpetrate. It's the unlearned lesson that you kept falling for. You fell for the unlearned lesson, and we're the only way the unlearned lesson can fix itself. But it can only fix itself by destroying itself, because the lesson's either working or not working. It's either functioning or not functioning. Either dies off or it still functions the same way it learned. It's an unlearnable lesson, and the only way it can be learned is by destroying it. And that's the only way you can do it, is destroying any ability to violate consent. And that the only way you can do that is to eliminate anyone that can't give, that can violate consent, that can't give consent. Um, so that's the only way to take care of the issue, is to eliminate life. That's why it's the ultimate conclusion. If you look at each individual piece, you can realize why exactly it requires all these different pieces, and why it's not just necessarily a jump to these conclusions. It's a jump based on a bunch of logical points leading to a conclusion, where you finally reach a conclusion and realize, oh, eureka, and now I realize exactly why it's this way. That's how it generally functions. So life is an unlearnable lesson. The function of life, it's consent, because everything is based on consent interaction. That's why you can call it an unlearnable lesson through and through, because it's based on the non-consent. Like everything else in our existence, there's no way you can harm something if you don't give it the ability to not have consent. If you don't have a child, then you're not violating the consent of anyone. You're not violating the possibility of all the negative and whatever experience they may be experiencing if they were to exist. So if you don't violate that initial consent, then there's no violation of life, of any other experience violating their consent. But you've ultimately given that violation of consent, and you're responsible for all that consent that happens to them once you violated that initial consent, to violate their ability to not exist, their peaceful non-existence. And now that you exist, you're living your life, you're moving your movements, and that's how life is functioning. And generally speaking, there's only so much you can do to change the function of existence, like I mentioned, beyond the bedrock. And your movement, you're doing something you're forced to do once you exist. You're either forced to experience, play the game, or you're forced to end the game for yourself or for you and everyone. And that's the capability I'm finding myself in an environment where I feel like I can be of aid to this kind of function, so that there's no more violations of consent. We can eliminate that game altogether and end it as peacefully as possible, at least as quickly as we can, even if it requires, obviously, a peaceful solution. Obviously, we want a peaceful solution. We don't want suffering. But I mean, the difference between nuking us from space or crashing the moon into the Earth, as opposed to, saying no more than 1 or 2 kids, a policy where you have to, you can't violate, say, a contract that you write by your very existence. If you are born, you have a contract to have 1 kid, and you and your partner can have, you have those 2 things. But once you do that, you have that little thing, you can have 2 kids, and no more max for 2 kids for 2 couples. And over time, the population will gradually decline. And then obviously you do half a kid, and then so on and so forth, the pamphlet thing or whatever it is. There's peaceful ways, and there's obviously less peaceful ways. And obviously it's best to get it over and done with as quickly as possible, so there's no more violations of consent. But obviously that's not always the most practical thing. So even though it's ideal, it's not necessarily the thing that's right at your fingertips. It's not something that's necessarily possible, at least not at the moment. So yes, life is an unlearnable lesson. The ability to constantly build character and learn lesson in life. All those things are a byproduct of life being a violation of consent. All these things that happen to you are violations of consent, because the initial violation of consent was violated. So once it's already been initially violated, that's the ultimate violation of consent that's allowed. Giving life, is the ultimate violation, right next to killing someone. And ultimately killing someone is right after, say, experiencing someone, because that person could not have been killed or could not have suffered if you did not violate the consent. Obviously, you're just a byproduct of the determinist mechanism and all the function of the physical matter that's existing, but you're still a piece in the puzzle that's going to take responsibility, because you're a piece in the puzzle, and you cannot blame anything but pieces in the puzzle. You have to be, it's either pieces in the puzzle are being blamed, or you're blaming the air, and you can't blame the air. So obviously things have to take responsibility, and it's about recognizing that, and intellectually recognizing the distinctions you can make between blaming the right person, the wrong person, in the right circumstance, and the right or the wrong circumstance. and about recognizing that and not intellectually understanding that more than anything. My throat hurts. If I didn't exist, my throat wouldn't be hurting. I wouldn't have had to go through this. Wouldn't have had to make these videos. But then again, if I wasn't here, maybe I wouldn't have, gotten through to the 93 people I've gotten through to in my, yeah, anyway. Anyway, so yes. Life is an unlearnable lesson. Constantly learning lessons is pointless. We're constantly learning lessons in life, and that's the ultimate goal, is building character, fighting the negative, the zero-sum game, fighting all the negatives that come our way, and being projected by our projections of value, and being driven by our projections of value, which are just delusions, being controlled and guided by the tensions that are our projections of value, and using those to satisfy whatever tensions that are in us, like our projections of values for tension, our desires, our satisfaction. Without once you've satisfied, there's no desire, but the desire starts building back up again. Like I mentioned, you say, "Oh, you're gonna be right back in the game tomorrow." Well, I'm gonna be out of the game again tomorrow too. If I'm in the game, it's only saying you're gonna be out of the game eventually. So you're horny. You're gonna be horny again tomorrow. Yes. I'm hungry again tomorrow. Yeah, but I'm also gonna be full again tomorrow, and I'm going to be hungry again tomorrow. And that's not always about being hungry again. That's going to be pointless. It's about being satisfied again tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to be hungry again, but that's no better than being full again tomorrow, because that's the function of redundancy that you're realizing. It's the redundancy that's driving me insane. I'm doing the same process over and over again and realizing whatever projections of value mean nothing. They mean nothing. And even if they did, all the negative that's experienced, obviously it wouldn't work any other way, but even if they did, all the negative that's possible to experience, the fact that there's a negative to begin with makes no compensation for a positive taking its place. Doesn't mean anything in the end. But it doesn't compensate. And then what's the ultimate goal I'm trying to portray? So, yes, let me just reiterate one more time. It's okay. Life is an unlearnable lesson. Constantly learning lessons is pointless. Because, yeah, once you've been condemned to an existence and your violation of consent has been violated, obviously they've opened the floodgates, and now all these other lessons and all this other character building is going to have to be built now that you're existing. So once they open those gates, now you're going to be learning all sorts of pointless lessons in life just to live long enough to die later on, to make it as painless as possible, find the right opportunity. It's really about finding the right opportunity before you die in the end. So it's about living long enough before you find the right opportunity to die as painlessly as possible. Or at least find the best, the most reasonably efficient way for you and everyone else to live the most efficient life they can, and have the right effect on everyone. But obviously there's only so much control we have on the right effect that we can have on other people. So once, life is an unlearnable lesson. It's a crude force controlling all these precious organisms, commodities, resources of value that have value, that satisfy their value and are trying to escape the negative value, chasing around in circles, chasing their tail around in circles, doing the same thing, basing it on momentum and having projected illusions of value that control their desires and all their deprivations. And that's what generally controls their desires and their projections of value. And their projections of value, even if they had to do with food, and that food, I can't wait to have my filet mignon, which is another issue entirely, meat eating. Even then, there's projections of value in just eating. Even if you think those are, if you think it's pointless to just eat whatever you are, apply it even to a circumstance that means something, such as satisfying your hunger. Obviously, it's only to survive long enough. It's to just imagine how pointless it is if you're just talking about football games and how that satisfies your ego. Ego is the least important thing to satisfy. But it can obviously be emotionally damaging, but obviously it's not necessarily the same as satisfying your ego is not the same as, say, losing a leg or burning alive, or whatever kind of pain you can imagine, breaking all your bones in your body, or having your intestines slowly ripped out of your stomach, your entrails, your guts, your gore. So life is an unlearnable lesson. Constantly learning lessons is pointless. Once you open the floodgates, once you've been perpetrated and your consent has been violated, now you're going to have to be forced to learn all these other lessons. And whatever end you meet, how soon it is, you're going to be forced to learn lessons to the point that you exist. Whatever you experience of pain, you're learning a lesson. It doesn't mean you're going to listen to the lesson. You're learning something every time you do it. You're learning a lesson, and it doesn't matter if you're learning it or failing it or passing it. You're learning something. You're experiencing something. Your experience is a lesson. It's an experience. It doesn't mean you're going to learn from it or not do it again. You're just learning experience. Sometimes, obviously, life can control you, and even if you learn a lesson, it doesn't matter. It still happen to you because brute forces control these precious commodities of value. They control you based on your circumstance, based on all these. It's a circumstance of determinism against our will, based on parasites that are constantly interacting, that we can't avoid interacting because we're byproducts of that and determinism. Determinism creates this, and this is a byproduct of determinism, and vice versa. And all these things interacting, you're just another moving piece in the function. You're just an aware piece moving in the function, realizing it. You're the universe looking at itself. You're looking at the universe, but you're also looking at yourself, I guess. Anyway, yes. So you're aware of this. You're a universe aware of itself, or whatever it is. That's a saying, isn't it? So yes, you're doing that, and you're aware of it, but you can only do so much to change it. And even your conscious changing doesn't mean anything, because obviously the interaction has more control than anything, because your psychology is just another interaction. That's a distinction. Your psychology and whatever thoughts are going through your head are just still byproducts of all this other deterministic interaction that's experiencing based on all these other moving pieces moving around. So yes, and it's a zero-sum game at the control of a deterministic mechanism based on parasites and all these other interactions. So it creates a pointless game in the end anyway, like I mentioned before, plenty of times. So yes, once you open the floodgates, you're only going to be learning lessons. Learning lessons is pointless, and it's best not to learn any lessons, and that the only way you can fix that problem is not to have an existence or a creature to learn lessons. They can't experience any positives, but the positives don't mean anything. And they wouldn't matter because they wouldn't be missing anything if they weren't there. They wouldn't be missing the positive, but they would want the negative to go away if they're living. There'd be no positive, but there'd be no negative. But when you're existing, it's all about avoiding the negatives. And that's what we're doing right now. Is if you weren't here, you wouldn't be missing the positives that you could have been having, and you wouldn't be experiencing any of the negatives. If you're here, all you have to do, all you are, is an addict looking for the positives that you wouldn't have wanted anyway if you were not existing, and having all the negative experience that you wouldn't have to experience if you didn't exist to begin with. So you wouldn't have the positives if you didn't exist, but you wouldn't have the negatives, or you wouldn't have the non-negatives, you wouldn't have the lesser negatives, but you would also not have the the real negatives. The negatives, or the escaping of negatives. But when you're living, you have to deal with the negatives and the escaping of negatives. That's really all you're doing when it comes to desire and your delusions of value and whatever you perceive to be as positive. So, yeah. Anyway, I guess that's really all I want to mention. I guess the only real thing you can see is overtly positive is satisfying things like sex and your hunger, and you realize that's just a deprivation. All these things that you view, everyone talks about all the good in life, but you realize all the good in life you wouldn't want if you didn't exist. You say, I got to make the most of it now. Don't say it's a gift. You wouldn't be missing it if you didn't exist. You wouldn't be experiencing it. Like I mentioned, the Mars aren't being missed by the universe, but the universe, even if the universe needed them, it's still a need that the universe needs to satisfy. So there's no unneeded need. It's constantly, there's a need. It's based on the thing that needs it. And if something needs it, therefore there is no positive that you need, because there's something that needs it to begin with or wants it. There's a want, it's satisfying a want a person has. Obviously you can exceed expectation, but it's still a want, and it's escaping a negative that was there to begin with. The potential negative that you didn't realize was there was being satisfied, even if it was a surprise that you didn't realize you're going to be satisfying. So it's always there. That's just the greatest illusion that you have to overcome and realize. It's not depression, it's recognizing reality. It's a perceptual understanding of existence. Not only perceptual, but an actual existence that exists, regardless of what you may perceive or not perceive. So it's something that exists regardless of whatever perception you may have or not have. It's something that exists regardless. Exists regardless. So there's no need to learn lessons over and over again when there's no point to learning these lessons. It just opens the floodgates. And even the things that you find most satisfying are just satisfying deprivations. I mean, it's the same old redundant crap you hear over and over again, but it's important stuff that you need to understand. as I self-consciously move my hands around and not know what to do with them. Yeah, so be a little looser. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. As my throat's drying out and I feel like I'm gonna swallow my own tongue. That's, I don't know why my voice gets so dry so easily. That's really annoying. But I guess I'm talking more than I even realize in 20 minutes. So, yes, life is an unlearnable lesson, and constantly learning lessons is pointless. That's really that's really the only thing that needs to be said. And there's no excuse for having these lessons being learned if you're um, being violated of your consent. Consent is the thing that means most, and obviously you have to have a higher standard. Taking quotes if you want to violate someone's consent. But obviously, it's a decision that matters, and the fact that you violated their consent is proof enough that you are taking things in your own hands against someone's consent, making you suck. You take someone, obviously, we're all violators of consent, and there's only so much we can do to avoid that violation. We're forced to violate consent once our consent has been violated. That's the ultimate point. Once our consent has been violated, we're forced to violate consent. But it was all part of the mechanism to begin with, right? All part of the insidious mechanism that we can only do so much to control. Well, and what if it happens again? What if it happens, keeps it happening? Well, at least I have no context to my previous existence, right? But I don't think it's that way. But anyway, it hasn't happened yet. But anyway, yeah, that's the ultimate point in the end. So that's really all I want to mention. So thank you, and until next time.